Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. This webinar is brought to you by the International Association for Impact Assessment Western and Northern Canada affiliate. My name is Jeff Rempel. I'm a board member, and I will be facilitating the conversation today. The topic of our conversation is impact assessment in the new forest fire regime, and we're really pleased to have an expert in the subject, Dr. Kevin Hanna, here presenting to us today. As noted on the screen, you can ask questions for Dr. Hanna using the Q&A feature. And assuming that you are not having problems because you're on the line, but if you did, we have the email address for IAIA WNC on the screen here as well. So I'll start off with a short introduction to Dr. Hanna, go over some ground rules, and then we'll turn it over to Kevin to deliver this exciting presentation. Okay, so Dr. Kevin Hanna grew up on his family's ranch in the southern interior of British Columbia. He's an alumnus of the University of British Columbia and the University of Toronto, where he obtained his PhD. Dr. Hanna is a faculty member at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus, where he teaches courses on environmental assessment and energy resources. He leads UBC's Center for Environmental Assessment Research, which is based at the Okanagan campus. Dr. Hanna has served on the BC government's Environmental Assessment Advisory Committee and the province's Environmental Assessment Implementation Committee. Presently, he co-chairs the federal government's Technical Advisory Committee on Science and Knowledge for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Dr. Hanna's research on environmental assessment methods and best practices integrate natural resource management and energy systems. In addition to many peer-reviewed papers, he has published 5 books, including the recent Handbook of Environmental Assessment that was published by Routledge. Just before I turn things over to Dr. Hanna, I'll go through a couple of the ground rules and logistics for this webinar. As noted, and you can see on the screen, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions of Dr. Hanna. We'll get to as many questions as we can during our Q&A time. And you can ask the questions anonymously if you'd like, but we'd really like to know who you are if you're comfortable with that. Also to note, with the Zoom webinar, you can interact in several ways with other participants' questions. You can reply to them using the comment feature, or you can give them a thumbs up if you like them, and that'll bump them up, and it'll be more likely that we'll be able to get to those and answer them. So feel free to thumbs up those questions that you think are really top of mind for you as well. You can message Randy if you're having any technical issues and need some support, so you should be able to see him in the participant list. And of course, we want to make sure that we're respecting everybody's time, so we'll do our best to keep the program to 1 hour, but really encourage people to continue the conversation afterwards, and Kevin will include his email on the last slide. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and Kevin can share his, and we'll get into it.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Jeff. Jeff, can you see the title page of my presentation?
Yeah, just make it full screen and we'll be good.
Okay. It does show it as full screen.
Okay, on mine, I still see kind of the slide sorter view.
Okay, sorry, we'll just try that again.
On the bottom left, there's those 3 little boxes. The third one on the right has the kind of the presentation. So it's there, it says normal view. Just to the left of normal view, there's a little, right at the very bottom left of the screen.
Yeah, okay, we're gonna try it again here. How's that?
Yeah, we got it, we're good.
Okay, right. Yeah, sorry, showing me something quite different. And again, thanks for the introduction, and thank you for everybody for joining me today, especially when I know it's lunch hour for many folks on the call. The work I want to talk about today is very formative, and or at least the ideas are a little bit formative, because we don't tend to think about wildfire as a specific item or factor in the environmental assessment process. One of the arguments I want to make is that it is something that in some parts of Canada we should be paying special attention to, in the assessment and probably other permitting processes as well. So for today, I'd want to run through the obligatory what I'm going to talk about, a brief introduction, go over the wildfire setting, just a reminder, a primer on the role of impact assessment in our setting, in our context, talk a little bit about the problem, and then two very general reviews of approach, one very briefly and the other I'll go into a little bit more detail. It's risk focused, and then I'll finish off with a summary. So there are a lot of tangential issues in this arena, to say the very least, but I do want to focus on the impact assessment role. The fire season last year, and I do live in Kelowna, was the most destructive ever, and it was very, very long. It began early and it extended into the fall, and this is a pattern we see generally in our wildfire seasons, and there's no reason to expect that that isn't going to get more difficult in the years to come. And certainly seeing a very small fire grow very quickly and then crest the mountains across the lake, then cross the lake and even threaten this very campus that I'm working from today, was a very sort of searing reminder of the presence, the continual presence and threat to our critical infrastructure that wildfire poses, particularly here in Western Canada. By mid-July of last year, we had 29 megafires exceeding 100,000 acres. By September 5th, we had about 6,100 fires that had burned some 16.5 million hectares. This is more than double the 1989 record. And I've highlighted a few things throughout the presentation in red, partially as a reminder for me, but as points I kind of want to emphasize and hope that they act as takeaways for today. Normally, and normally should probably be in quotation marks, an annual average of about 2.5 million hectares is burned in Canada. This was a very widespread and difficult fire season from the West Coast to the Atlantic provinces and Canada's north. There were significant fires across Quebec, Ontario, and Atlantic Canada. So it was not just a Western Canadian phenomena. This is very much the product of a number of legacies, but very much compounded by the reality of climate change. And I've taken this also from NRCan's website, giving you the date there. Happy to provide the link to anybody who would like it. So is it record setting? Well, I mentioned 1989 and the importance of 2023, but if we think about the area burned, the infrastructure damage, then we have to remember we always seem to be setting record years. 2017, 2018, 2023, all record-setting years. So this is a trend that is something that we have to consider and think about in terms of a lot of aspects of project design, implementation, regulation, and approval. So my key questions, there are three key questions for today, is really focused on the role of environmental impact assessment in thinking about this difficult context. First of all, is there a role for EIA in addressing wildfire risk? If so, what can or should that role be? And a reminder, not a question per se, but a statement that EIA is an early stage planning tool and wildfire response should be too. We could reframe that a little bit as a question. If we think about EIA as an early stage planning tool, then how do we bring wildfire response and wildfire thinking into that process? The Canadian environmental assessment context bears a little bit of reminder. We have federal, provincial, and territorial processes. We have in our country a process that is based on the project. It reviews and considers the project. There are strategic and regional strategic processes. They reside primarily at the federal level, but usually what we are dealing with is an assessment process that looks at a project. It tends to be focused on major projects as well. Despite some of the attention in the media, environmental assessment is not omnipresent, focuses on big things. And both federally and provincially, we don't conduct that many in terms of absolute numbers every year, but we are looking at big undertakings. It is part of and linked to other permitting systems. There's a lot of discussion about various efficiencies in that regard, but it's not the only thing. And just because a project isn't subject to environmental impact assessment doesn't mean that it won't be subject to other permitting processes. They almost always are. And some of those bear many of the hallmarks or stage characteristics of EIA. It's proponent-led, but there are multiple actors, including federal and provincial agencies, Indigenous organizations and Indigenous governments, the public, NGOs, and other entities that provide information, comment, and occasionally even lead part of those processes. There are some uncertainties. I'll start off with politics and the longevity or stability of our EIA processes. Certainly a conversation about that federally with the potential for a change in government. There is the recent Supreme Court decision and the federal government's current work. We hope to see some of the outcome of that in terms of the proposed amendments to make the federal act more compliant with the decision of the Supreme Court. So there are a few uncertainties around that, but there are certainly things that will remain intact or remain the same. And there's potential for reforms at the provincial level too. I believe Ontario has had that process ongoing for a little while now. And in other provinces, BC, of course, redid its act to align the federal process and to update it. But that's generally the context we're dealing with. And I think the key thing to remember is the project, which is what I tend to think about a lot in this arena. So why do we need to worry and integrate this thinking? Well, first of all, it's not going to get better. We will have good, bad, and ugly years, but the prognosis for wildfire risk is that it will continue and that there are a lot of uncertainties and unknowns around that, but we won't enter a period where wildfire is not present or is not part of what we have to worry and think about. It poses a clear danger to many places across Western and Northern Canada, remote, urbanized, to our linear infrastructure, which is in some ways particularly vulnerable. And in that respect, some of our projects are more vulnerable than others in terms of their location and type. And this becomes a key characteristic, part of our thinking about how we might weave wildfire risk into our impact assessment processes. Some projects are critical infrastructure. So if they're threatened or they can't function or work, their impact on the well-being of citizens can be outsized relative to other projects. Government wildfire policy, planning, and actions are in some respects still catching up to on-the-ground reality. We can have a little bit of a conversation about that later on, but I do want to focus not so much on the response to wildfire or some of the other kind of mitigation prevention conversations that are going on around wildfire policy, mostly at the provincial level. But it is fair to say that there's a lot of work that's been done and that has come about in the last year in which we do see provincial governments recognizing that it's not just about suppression, but there's these other dynamics that we have to put front and foremost. Having said that, if you look at the recent BC budget, the current budget, it is mostly focused on suppression, and the investments we might have hoped to see in prevention and mitigation are still to come, but these are very, very important elements. A question that one of my colleagues posed to me recently, and I think it's really very relevant to a conversation about wildfire and project-based assessment, is what might the role be, or will industry need to fill some gaps? And that could be around data, around information, around prevention, mitigation. The role of industry potentially in suppression, wildfire fighting is one that I haven't seen really emerge so much and is probably unlikely other than in a support contract role, but certainly in terms of the design and even something as operational as fuel load mitigation near or around projects is an area where I think we have to see more industry engagement and conversation. So generally, when we think about where we might nest or place a conversation about wildfire in the impact assessment process, it's come up in two approaches. One, and I remember a colleague with a consulting firm saying, well, isn't this simply something that we can embed in the impact of the environment on the project, which is a requirement in some impact assessment processes. It's part of the federal process. And my answer to that is that that does seem to be kind of a convenient way of thinking about it, but the risk is so significant and so distinctive in some parts of Canada and to some projects that it really does warrant specific attention. So leaving it to the impact of the environment on the project, it really, in my thinking, isn't good enough. But from a regulatory perspective, if that's where or how we're going to couch it, then this might have some utility. What I prefer is to think about the specific risks to the project, which is an element that's present in many aspects of impact assessment requirements and attention. So here we think, or we ask the question, is the project at risk from wildfire? And in many respects, the answer to that is going to be very, very locational. So if we move from thinking about probability and likelihood to inevitability, which is another shift in kind of risk calculus, then we come to a point where we're really saying to ourselves, okay, fire is going to come. Our project is in a location where it has occurred in the past and the risk could be recurrent, or where it hasn't occurred, but we know that the risk is extremely high. Let's not talk about likelihood and probability, but just say it's inevitable. So if it comes, what are we going to do? And this puts us in a very different place. We're in a risk management frame where we're focused on what are the consequences of fire. So assuming that it comes, we then begin to imagine, what does it look like? What is the duration? What are these other qualities? And then how is that going to interact with our project? So the risk management scenario leads us to think about scenarios where the risk management context, pardon me, begins to lead us to think about scenarios. So where, when, how long, and what is the severity and intensity of the fire? So to answer those fundamental questions, and in some respects they're very difficult to answer because there's a variety of contexts or dynamics, but to really point us in that direction and get us a little bit more comfortable with answering them, we think about the data we'll need, what information we can construct from that, and then knowledge going forward, and different forms of knowledge. So not just necessarily technical engineering or scientific knowledge, but knowledge from Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge keepers, and in other communities in or around projects. What are our uncertainties? So the things that we don't know, the unknowables, and then the proxies. And the proxies are a very interesting one from a methodological perspective, because we could, this is what some of my thinking is around, what are the ecological proxies, particularly around severity and intensity, that might be used to understand the potential risk of wildfire to a project. So, for example, if we identify areas where wildfire severity or intensity is predicted to be very high, very problematic, then we could ask, does that, or is that information that we can use to understand the specific risks to the project, the way it's designed, located, or operated? Going on to our third point here, we can think about what can be done to manage impacts in terms of prevention, mitigation, and minimization. So these can become very technically focused options. So the prevention of fire in, around, or near the project when it comes, is there a way of preventing it to get to a certain point? Are there mitigations to reduce intensity of severity? Are there ways of minimizing the impact of fire, even if these other controls aren't as effective, on the actual operation of the project itself? So that can become an engineering design component. So from the options that we might have available, we think about the different trade-offs. And one that often comes to mind is, well, what is the cost? But we can also think about effectiveness. We can think about other risks that might be created from the types of options that we might implement. And then what are the benefits overall? We can feed those back into thinking about those other trade-offs. Another dynamic, and it's borrowed from risk management thinking, is to understand how the risk management decisions we make today might affect future options, either for expansion, development, or operation of the project or other projects, and to maybe nest it in a cumulative effects context too. And the last point under risk management is, what is the proponent's role in all of these? And I would circle that back to that third bullet point in terms of what the proponent can do in terms of prevention, mitigation, and minimization. And sometimes those dynamics will be very design oriented. In fact, I would expect in many cases they are, but it does point us to thinking more innovatively maybe about the social context as well, in terms of where and how risk is conceptualized and accepted, but also how we live with wildfire on the land. And that's a very large and important conversation too, if we think more broadly about policy around mitigation and prevention. And I'm just cognizant of the time, so I'm keeping an eye on that because I would like to leave a little bit of time for questions. So at this point, I'm just going to pause. And I think I did mention that the work and the thinking is a little bit formative. So some of the ideas are really at a very, very high level. But we've also begun in our research group here at UBC to think about some of the specific questions for the project and then how those might relate back to regulatory impact assessment. But importantly, and I think most importantly, the work of consultants and proponents in this arena as well. So for the project, our initial list, some of which is very specific, some which a little bit higher level, is to think about the footprint of the project itself. Is it small, large, or is it linear? And obviously, these different scales or dynamics are going to pose a lot of important questions for the kind of data and information that we need to understand the wildfire risk characteristics of the project itself. I do a lot of thinking about linear projects, particularly electrical infrastructure and the electrical grid in terms of its vulnerability, because you can imagine over many thousands of kilometers, particularly for our big supply lines, our trunk lines, understanding the potential risk of wildfire to impact the operation of those systems is it could be and should be a very significant question in operation and design. But of course, all of our linear facilities are roads, which are important for the delivery of goods and services to Canadians, but also as potential evacuation routes in areas that might be severely impacted by wildfire, our railways, and also our pipeline infrastructure. Many Canadians don't realize, and if there's any pipeline operators on the call today, it'd be great to connect with you, but many people don't realize that pipelines actually aren't that deep underground, but there isn't a great understanding of the potential wildfire risks to the line itself, but perhaps even more importantly, that critical surface infrastructure that keeps the system running. So a small, large, or linear footprint. Next one is a little bit cheeky. Does it matter to anyone other than the proponent? There are some projects that if wildfire comes, an interruption of the operation or the destruction of property or some other operational aspect of the project might not matter too much to people beyond the proponent itself. Some projects are critical infrastructure. So if they are affected or by wildfire in some way, they will have a notable or outsized impact on well-being or other services and other infrastructure. Drilling down to the project itself, we think about what are the critical components to the continued operation or resilience of the project. What are the most vulnerable places in the project plan? Under what kinds of wildfire conditions would it continue to function? So are there feeder mechanisms in terms of transportation, power, water, natural gas, and so forth, that if they are interrupted, the project wouldn't continue to operate? And what would those interruptions mean? How would they be temporary? Would they be something that we could recover, or repair, or fix relatively quickly? So taking that a little bit further, under what wildfire conditions would the project itself fail? So this, again, for those of you really interested in risk scenarios and developing trees or bow tie analysis around thinking about this, really begins to get us to think about those critical components in a really interesting and important design way as well. Are we planning for prevention and prepared for suppression? We do rely on government in many ways, but I think it's fair to say that there can and should be a role for proponents going forward, not only in terms of identifying prevention and suppression needs, but even the potential for participating, notably, maybe less so in suppression, but notably in prevention. The last one, which is actually quite specific, is what could the role of the proponent be in mitigation? So one example might be fuel reduction, controlled burns, and protection work in areas surrounding the project. And what kind of partnering or permitting process might be required to get that going? I'll give you an example. We know in British Columbia that the process that provincial agencies go through to get permission and to conduct a controlled burn is a long one, and it's compounded by the fact that decision-making and consultation is fractured among multiple agencies that exist in different ministries. So if the proponent is going to play a role in mitigation, what is the kind of cooperation and collaboration with other participants in the regulatory process, but potentially even other proponents or other operators in an area might have to be put in place. So these are the kinds of specific questions that we've begun to think about. And of course, you can imagine all the sub-questions and then the thinking a little bit around data and information needs that we would have to have in place going forward. However, it's all contextual. Every project is different, it has different qualities. Operators have different capacities and experiences in this realm. So questions for the project, we tend to like generic or templated questions lists, but they do have to be tailored very much to the individual characteristics and qualities of the project itself. So a bit of a non sequitur, and the reason I'm kind of landing on this is I get asked this question a lot, is should there be a provincial role in an arena that's particularly or federal role, pardon me, in an arena that is particularly provincial. And we know how sensitive provincial governments can be about a federal role in what they consider to be their backyard. Having said that, there are 5 areas where I think, where I believe, I won't say I think, I believe the federal government can play actually a key role. First is funding for provincial and territorial wildfire programs to support not only suppression, but importantly, prevention, mitigation, and forward planning. The second is a role in coordinating and the moving of resources for wildfire suppression, mitigation, fighting, and so forth nationally, but also bilaterally. This is a continental challenge and a continental problem. And many of the challenges that we face, it could be something as glaring and as difficult as smoke and its impact on community and community health. That smoke might not be coming from a Canadian fire, but from an American fire. So we do share resources bilaterally, and the wildfire fighting services in both countries do collaborate and share resources, people resources on an ongoing basis, but there can be a role for better coordination. There's been conversations about the need for that too, less ad hoc and more structured and more strategic. There is the potential for a wildfire service. The Army, the military does come in to help out on occasion, but soldiers are not firefighters. And there has been a conversation, which I think is actually an important one, about what a federal wildfire service could look like and how it would work collaboratively and dovetail with provincial agencies and their needs across Canada, and then to provide a national resource that's deployable, maybe to regions that haven't experienced a lot of wildfire recently, and find that those resources are really being stretched. We've seen a really big budget increase focused on here in British Columbia, but I don't know necessarily whether that is being repeated elsewhere in the country. So the potential for even very targeted federal resources in terms of the federal wildfire service could be quite helpful. We also need to ensure that wildfire risk and vulnerability assessments and considerations are really part of our reviews for critical infrastructure and other projects that federal agencies review and approve. And this comes back to really focusing on that key question, is the project at risk? And then sustained support for wildfire research. Of course, working in a university, we always like to advocate for sustained support for research generally. So a summary for today, ask the question, don't ask for regulators. So is the project at risk from wildfire? And if the answer to that is yes, then we assume that it's going to happen. Treat it as a risk, but know it's going to happen. Work to manage the risk. Acknowledge, prepare, and work to make the project resilient. Importantly, communicate, collaborate, and partner, not only with government, but with other operators, with Indigenous governments, provincial governments, the federal government. Don't rely solely on government, but understand that that kind of communication, collaboration, and partnership is going to be very, very key going forward to project resilience and to really understanding, managing, and mitigating risk. Environmental impact assessment is an early stage planning tool. Statement I made right at the front of this presentation today. Our wildfire response should be too. So there is a role for connecting the two, for asking that very specific question. And I acknowledge that that's going to be more important and more inevitable in some parts of Canada than in others. My final shot little bit, but not too much of a non sequitur, is that denialism about the reality of climate change is at best unhelpful and at worst dangerous. And it's always curious and somewhat, tragically amusing to watch some politicians contort themselves into trying to respond to the reality of wildfire, but avoid saying the words climate change or even energy transition. So denialism might prevent us, especially if it's allowed to dominate some conversations, from making the important adaptation and policy decisions that are going to be necessary to deal with a challenge that does have a variety of legacy issues, but has been compounded and made even more immediate by the reality of climate change. So I think that's my last substantive slide for today, and keeping it on time. Lots of room for Q&A here. And I want to do a little bit of a shout out to folks who are, well, a couple of shout outs. First of all, to my colleague, Jeff and Shima Miller, for sharing pictures from his wildfire service days. Mine were much too long ago. His are more recent, and he's got some great photos, which I've used in the presentation today, mostly from southern British Columbia over the last few years. So thanks very much, Jeff. And the other one is we would really like to connect with people who are working in consulting and proponent world to find out how they're thinking about wildfire, the risk, the kinds of technical engineering and design decisions, but also maybe some of the operational or community interaction decisions and activities that they're undertaking relative to their projects, things that are being planned, but things that are built and operating right now, because I think there's a wealth of experience, knowledge, and ongoing activities. I certainly see that some of our utilities in Western Canada, which really provide good learning experiences for others who are working in this arena and who are thinking about wildfire as a risk to their projects or as a risk component in the work that they're doing. That's my email address. Anybody's welcome to reach out. And with that, I think I'm wonderfully on time. Lots of time to get people back to their sandwiches or to ask some questions. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. That was fantastic, and as you noted, increasingly pertinent in the current reality that we find ourselves. We have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat. I also wanted to note that we can allow for folks to turn on their microphones to be unmuted, and even to show their camera if they would like to ask questions in person. Just raise your hand with the raise a hand feature at the bottom, and we can allow you to ask that question directly. There's one question that's the top question, I guess, that has one thumbs up on it, coming from Claire. And Claire's asked, I'm curious if you've connected with CAPE, and that stands for the Canadian Physicians for the Environment, on health effects of wildfire smoke.
The short answer to that is no. Although I think it's a really interesting question. Certainly, because I think about summer and smoke a lot. It's not an area I work in. Having said that, I do know that there are folks in community health who are really interested in this as a topic, but also as one where more research, particularly in protecting health, is concerned. So that's kind of a long, wandering answer to your question, Claire. I'm sorry, but the short answer, no. I recognize it as an important challenge or outcome, and I'll just pause there.
No, that's great. Thank you for that answer. It actually kind of sparks one in my mind. As we know, in impact assessment, there's often a variety of different biophysical and socioeconomic valued components, and one of them is health or human health, and so in that context, or even more broadly into other VCs, when we're thinking about the underpinning of impact assessment and the concept of baseline data or existing conditions, how should impact assessors, how do you think impact assessment practitioners should think about the concept of baseline data, considering the new shifting realities of forest fires and climate change?
Yeah, I think baseline data. How to even define a baseline temporally is there perennial questions in assessment practice for sure. This one is probably a little bit more immediate because I think to assess or to understand risk, we would be dealing with, and I'm thinking of this very biophysically too, but you can also conceptualize it socially, culturally. We would be thinking about the conditions as they are right now for immediate risk identification. Having said that, though, being able to understand how climate change is going to change based on the environment going forward might mean that we're rethinking or trying to imagine what future ambient or sort of neighborhood conditions are going to be over the next decade or two relative to our project. So this is a really bedeviling one for sure, but it becomes really, really critical to understanding our risk points. And again, I realize I kind of focus on linear projects, but imagining all those potential risk points along a project length, and then thinking, okay, is there a severity or an intensity index I would apply to that? You can imagine the kind of data, the baseline understanding of context that you're going to have in place to be able to model or predict that or predict or model that. So it's really very, very critical, not only for what is there now, maybe more so than what was there in the past, but thinking about how that's going to change in the decades to come, and whether the potential for change is that it gets better if there's fuel load reduction, for example, or if wildfire goes through an area, reduces the fuel load and reduces some of our risk characteristics. But being able to predict and understand that going forward, I think is a really key challenge. Do I have an answer for that? No, except we need to think about it, look at it, put a lot of resources into that. And it really changes some of our kind of our modeling about the environment relative to the project itself too.
Yeah, that certainly is a tough one. Good, very, very thought provoking. Another one that's come in here, I'll kind of ask it in the opposite order that it's come in. It's a two-part question. So the second part is how do we go about thinking about the project's potential contribution to increased wildfire risk? And so that's the way it's framed as opposed to risks to the project. Have there already been changes about how impacts of the project to the wildfire are being thought about in this regime?
Yeah, I always joke, all questions are good, some are interesting. This is a really interesting one. Because I think, the way I've certainly presented it today, I'm thinking it in one direction. But in terms of prevention, mitigation, even suppression, there's a lot of room for imagining how the project could make things better or worse. So there's also sorts of very specific examples. If the project, for example, facilitates more backcountry access to people, then theoretically that could increase the risk of human-caused wildfire. And generally, if a fire starts along a road, our safe assumption is it's been human-caused. Not necessarily, but it's a pretty safe assumption. So there are ways of identifying, okay, what is it about the operation of the project itself? And, which is important, that's one stage in the project's life, that might pose a risk to causing wildfire or making wildfire worse. So that's one kind of realm of thinking, and it can be a design, a routing question, can be an operational question, technology question. The other dynamic is that to think about the temporal risks too, that there's different phases. We might find that the risk of the project in terms of causing or contributing to wildfire is during the construction phase. So how do we minimize those risks and really bring them down or be prepared to address them when and if they occur? That's different than the operational stage. And then then we think about decommissioning. So our monitoring and follow-up in the longer term after the project ceases to operate as well. But I don't want to imagine for a moment that this is a conversation that goes only in one direction. It's at the doorstep. What does it mean? But rather, what is it that the project may do to make things worse? But also, can the project make things better? So there are some projects that for example, once they're built, running and so forth, could provide good access for firefighting, good access for managing and controlled burn, or other forms of fuel load mitigation. Or even, I'm not sure I mentioned, even the potential for evacuation of people from areas of danger or risk. So I think we also have to maybe think creatively about some of our projects. And if, for example, it's accompanied by a reservoir, is that something that then provides a net benefit for firefighting in the future? Does the project itself lend the potential for fuel load mitigation or changing some of the forest management practices in the environment around it that would reduce that risk? So think of it as positives and negatives that might come from the project, but also think about it temporally. Are there periods of the project's life cycle that are more problematic than others?
Thanks for that response. That's great. Actually, it gets me thinking about when you mentioned where it finds its home in the EA and whether that's under the project effects on the environment. We're seeing more terms of reference and joint guidelines and application information requirements that are including sections on climate change and on resilience, and I'm thinking that as a theme to be able to weave in throughout all of the VC specific chapters. Is probably a good place for some of this discussion to occur too, right within all of those VECs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the other one which I didn't put up there specifically, but I'm also keenly aware that there are limits to what regulators can ask for. So we may need to say, okay, we want to know what the wildfire risks are that are associated with the project. But we're classifying that or considering that under the rubric of impacts of the environment on the project. My push, if there's one message today, is really just to get regulators to ask that question. But to understand it might not be relevant to all projects in all places, but there are many locations in Western Canada, because any of us working in energy and mining know this, where we're right at the interface, or we are at areas that haven't burned yet, but are ripe for it. So what are we going to do? But importantly, what are other proponents and so forth doing in this arena? I think some really interesting work that's being done by utilities to protect their power lines. What can we learn from that? Particularly if they're putting a lot of thinking into kind of risk point identification.
Two more questions here in the chat, and we still have more than 15 minutes, so let's keep it going. It's a great conversation.
Yep.
One that's coming from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak to some of the work you're doing with the, in all caps, WIRED program, and how multidisciplinary response is so necessary for this approach?
So WIRED is interesting. It's had a little bit of profile in the media. It's a joint US-Canada initiative in Canada. It's led by folks at the University of Calgary. UBC is part of that. I think there's 4 of us from UBC participating, and then there a group in the US is led from the University of Utah and a number of other American schools. It's focused on the protection of the Western power grid and power production from wildfire risk. So it is quite focused, but it has an engineering, technical, regulatory, social economic component to it. It's, I think, 4 or 5 years in length, and you need a multidisciplinary approach to really understanding how you can protect critical infrastructure, but also what it means to people, to communities, how you can build maybe social acceptance for some of the mechanisms that are going to be necessary to, for example, implement control burns in some areas, or if there is increased costs associated with protecting critical power infrastructure. I think that the wildfire arena, like many others, maybe even more so than some others, really requires a highly multidisciplinary response, in part because there's both the suppression component, but then the upfront mitigation, prevention component too, which we're paying more attention to, but have yet to put the resources that are necessary into that. WIRED is a little bit different because it is very, very much about protection and upfront investments, particularly in important design characteristics to protect that infrastructure. And I think there was one question that just vanished. If I
It vanished because I sent a private note to
oh, okay.
the questioner asking if they wanted to bring it forward, but I'll mention it here, and it is a nice segue from what you were just talking about prevention. The question is, in your experience, are projects open to discussing preventative measures for wildfire risk, i.e., fuel mitigation, relocation, etc.? And then a following comment. From my previous work in wildfire field, it seems as though many people prefer to focus on suppression and cleanup measures when the fire occurs and are generally not forward thinking about prevention measures. If a project is deemed at risk, are projects required to implement mitigation methods?
Hmm. Uh, yeah, they potentially could be. I can't think of an example of where I've seen that. Doesn't mean that it isn't out there. Um, but if there was if it was identified as a key risk to the project or vice versa, I mean, in theory, the regulator could ask for appropriate mitigation. Again, it depends on the jurisdiction too, how far they go down that road. So there's kind of variable experience with that. And there's a lot of dynamics that I don't think we understand well enough. So we know, for example, that deciduous growth is fairly resistant to wildfire, depending on the conditions. Does that necessarily mean that the vegetation that grows under a power line or over top of a pipeline is more resistant to fire or not? It might depend on drought and other conditions. So I think there's a lot of work or study that needs to be done, because there could be some really great kind of natural characteristics we can build into our projects that would add a preventative quality. But it's totally true. The emphasis on suppression, we see that in the BC budget, and and in no way do I ever want anyone to imagine that suppression is not important. I also think rapid response is important too, particularly to small fires that pose risk to urban areas, but also critical infrastructure. That's a little bit of a policy rethinking. But I don't think you have to take out of one basket to fill another basket partially. We should be investing in both of those areas too. And I realize government has limited resources and a whole range of priorities, but prevention and mitigation is really, really important. And at the end of the day, if we get that right, that's going to help with suppression as well. It doesn't mean that fires won't happen. They will, but there may be fewer, they may be less intense, they may be less problematic, they may not occur in areas that that we deem as being particularly important or particularly critical because we made that investment beforehand, or if they do come, they're less intense, less long-lived, less problematic, easier to put out and easier to fight. So suppression is absolutely essential. We need to up our investment and our game in that area to rethink some of our suppression approaches, but we also have to put resources into prevention, mitigation, and risk reduction. And I think critically, if government isn't going to do that, proponents have to think about that too. I can't imagine there's any proponent that wants their project to catch fire, to burn. If it comes to the gate, you want to be able to ensure that it's going to continue to operate, or that you're going to get your folks out safe, but there will be something to come back for them to come back and operate.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, regulatory driven or not, proponents of big infrastructure projects investing tons of money or wanting to protect their assets, and they're doing their
Yeah,
risk analysis, and
I couldn't agree.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree, Jeff. We often forget that I don't know, some of the leading innovation, including in environmental protection, a whole range of areas, are not necessarily driven by government or regulation, but by innovation that industry itself brings forward. So there are lots of good examples of good practice coming from business initiative, and there's room in this field for that as well too. And I think some are already thinking about that, and others maybe aren't quite there yet. But I would not wait for the instruction necessary from government, but begin to think about your project as it is now, or as it might be if you're going through the approval process, and what the risks from wildfire necessarily are. You can extend that further, if you're thinking about flood, drought impacts, low water years, and so forth, great. But you also need to think about wildfire if you're in an area where it can happen, will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got time for one more that's come in here. Kevin, can you speak a little bit more about the idea of forest fire vulnerability assessments and how they can be used to help us design, improve, and build more resilient infrastructure? And then the second part of the question is, where should we focus research to address uncertainties in relation to this?
Yeah, the whole fire, the world of fire, what it is for us now has changed so dramatically. I have seen many wildfires over the years, but I saw nothing like what came over the mountains on the west side of Lake Okanagan last August. It was truly horrifying. So we're living in a very different kind of fire regime. And I think we have to accept that that is part of what we're going to be living with for a while. So if we accept that they are more frequent, more intense, that they're bigger, more powerful, and I will say once that one got going, I don't think anything was going to stop it. Just a variety of lucky serendipitous moments in terms of wind and other shifts that helped. But if we know that, we understand that potential is there, then we step back and say, okay, what do we learn from that event in terms of our initial response, in terms of the potential for mitigation measures, the way we plan and design our communities, the location of our critical infrastructure? How do we reconceptualize risk to move away from, playing a little bit of a betting game around it, probability and likelihood, but rather to accept inevitability and say, okay, it's going to come. What do I need to do design-wise to ensure, the resilience of the project? And under what conditions can I not make it resilient? Okay, so can I change those conditions in terms of the environment around the project so that it will survive? It'll be okay after fire passes. But also to accept that fire is a self-limiting process. It does, burn itself out of food and home eventually. So those in places where it does occur, there's a change in the risk profile. All of this is really, the reality of what it is today, the reality of how climate change has affected our fire regime and wildfire context. Taking all of that information, that understanding, some of which we have at hand, and some of which we're really going to have to think creatively or more innovatively in terms of our knowledge needs going forward. These are the areas where we really have to kind of, it starts with acceptance, and then it moves into what is it we don't know or we're uncertain about? Can those gaps be filled? And then what kinds of research investments, data investments do we have to make to get to that? So I've wandered a little bit in answering your question, Jeff, because it's a really, really big question. But I think if I had to kind of focus on a couple of things where we could focus research and knowledge building, data, information, and knowledge building, it is around where are the riskiest places and why are they risky? And then what can we do to manage that? And then the next thing being, what are the design characteristics that are inherently resilient? What is it about my project that's particularly vulnerable? And how can I reduce that vulnerability? So wildfire vulnerability assessment will borrow from all of the other areas of risk where we're well-versed and we have a good history of doing work. But really, we're embedding wildfire into that thinking and then asking ourselves, what's different about wildfire from other types of risks that we're comfortable or have a history of analyzing? I'm going to stop. I could wander a lot on this one.
That's great. And I think we could probably move towards concluding the session here. So yeah, it's been really thought-provoking, or a really great subject. Certainly, lots of work and collaboration to do between government, between proponents. Academia has a role there, and it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's going to become more and more prevalent. So thanks so much for this great presentation, Kevin. As a token of our appreciation from the IAIA WNC board, we'll be offering to provide you with a annual membership valued at $30, or extending your existing membership if you already have one. Also, just a plug there for those that are on the line, if you don't have a membership for IAIA WNC, it's a great investment. You can hear conversations like this and other that are really important to the impact assessment community and the conversation. So I don't know how the applause thing works here on the virtual Zoom. I'll just do it in reality. Thanks so much, Kevin. It's been great. And as you mentioned, if folks want to continue the conversation with you, your email address was on your last slide there. And yeah, thank you very much. Any kind of concluding thoughts from your end?
No, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, anyone's welcome to reach out and tell us what you're thinking and what you're working on in this area too. This is really very important. Everything we do at this research center is quite applied, and usually with industry, government, or Indigenous governments and organizations. So we like the connection to the practitioner experience. It's really, really important. I was told a little while ago, and I've heard this a couple of times, that people are afraid of summer because what it's going to bring. And I really want us to move beyond that, but get into a place where we're not fearful of something, but rather we're working to kind of control our interaction with it, and understand it better and figure out how we can reduce the things that cause that fear, smoke and fire.
No, that's a great concluding thought. Well, thank you again, and we'll be in touch. Much appreciated.
Take care, and thank you for the invitation.
Of course.